Okay, I'm assuming I don't have to do a description of my background or anything. I mean, probably those of you heard me talk before, so I'm going to skip that and just launch into this discussion of resilience or resiliency or whatever you want to call it here, I guess. And of course, just as in the past here, feel free to break in and make comments or ask questions or whatever, or if you want to, you could put it in the chat box. And if I miss it, Ryan can bring my attention to it, and I'll try to answer the question or whatever it is here. So this subject, resiliency, this has always been, like, I've been in child welfare since 1971 or something, my whole entire adult life, really. And this subject has been of interest throughout that entire time. There has never been a time when people were not interested in the extent to which kids can recover from experiences of child maltreatment, not to mention other kinds of trauma. So this has always been, and there has over the years been a lot written on this subject, though not always from a child welfare perspective. So a lot of times the books have been in relationship to kids growing up in poverty or with substance abuse or with domestic violence or in a variety of other ways. And more recently, in the last decade or two, of course, much more interest in how children recover from trauma, broadly considered, which might, of course, include child maltreatment, but it also can include other kind of things as well. So kind of an enduring interest here. So normally in this conversation, then, there is both in the scholarly literature, but also in just everyday discussions of it, there's kind of two different meanings of resilience. One meaning is some degree of immunity, not exactly, it's not the same thing as invulnerability, but having a relative degree of protection, so to speak, from the consequences of negative events, whether that would be, some kind of acute traumatic event, or whether that would be child maltreatment in its various forms, and more recently, a huge amount of interest in the subject of child removal and the extent to which that harms kids and how they recover from that and whether they recover and so forth, right? So that's one meaning of it. And we're going to come back to that in a minute, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The other meaning, of course, has to do with the ability to rebound from adversity. And so this means that, of course, that people, children, other people do suffer negative effects from all kinds of events. And the question is the extent to which they can recover. And so here, let me just say that there was a time way back when, maybe 30, 40 years ago, and then there was really going around what I would call kind of a myth. And this was in the 1980s. There was even a book that came out that I read at the time called The Invulnerable Child. Like, there were allegedly at that point, there were some children who were just so robust in their psychological development that somehow they just didn't show negative responses to child maltreatment in the way that most kids did. And so these were viewed as very exceptional children, and almost kind of like a mystery as how they got to be the way they were, and speculation about whether that was genetics or whether it was something in their early childhood that hadn't been discovered, or something having to do with temperament, or, all manner of speculation. And then over the next decade or two, it became obvious that that this was really kind of a misunderstanding thing here, that in relationship to either severe or chronic maltreatment, and it can be either one, there are no invulnerable kids. And the same thing would be true in regard to trauma when it's chronic, or what is sometimes called complex trauma, that is, trauma that's inflicted by caregivers, that is also chronic. There are no invulnerable kids. There's only a question of the extent to which those kids can rebound from adversity, kind of thing there, right? So to give an example of how this distinction works, so if you remember, as I'm sure you do, the events of 9/11, when the towers came down in New York City, there were kids in the elementary school range who were kind of witnesses to those towers collapsing and people dying and smoke and fear and all of that. And so subsequent to those events, there was quite a bit of research in the next few years, within the next 4 or 5 years, about, well, what happened to those kids? I mean, what happened to those just normal range of elementary school kids, maybe somewhere between 6 and 11 at the time of those events? What happened to them over time? And so, maybe the most surprising feature of that research was that most of the kids did not show PTSD symptoms. That is, not speaking of trauma broadly considered, but just in terms of the four main symptoms, which normally define PTSD, that is flashbacks, intrusive memories, hypervigilance, numbing, dissociation. Most of those kids didn't show any effect at all, but there were maybe 10 to 20% of the kids, depending on the study you did. And then there was more research about, well, what happened to those kids? I mean, the ones who did show PTSD symptoms, the extent to which they recovered, in the sense defined as the symptoms going away over time. And of course, the main finding there, it would be a common sense one, and probably one that my guess is you can probably guess without me telling you. So what do you think the main finding was about kids who recovered? That is, they had PTSD symptoms following the events of 9/11, but upon entering treatment, they recovered fairly quickly. What do you think was the main reason that those kids recovered? And when I tell you, of course, it's going to sound like real common sensey stuff here. They had supportive parents. And it was kind of as simple as that. It didn't have to do with the kid's psychological attributes. It didn't have to do with the severity of the symptoms. It just had to do, with the extent to which they had parenting that was pretty nurturing, pretty caring, pretty persistent. And so that's kind of one of the lessons here, of course, about resiliency in general. It just doesn't have to do with the psychological attributes of people, as important as those are, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. It also has to do with, of course, the quality of their caregiving. And as they get older, it has a lot to do with the quality of the social environment. So, for example, what if a kid, living in an inner city neighborhood is traumatized when they're very young by, maybe they're witnesses to gun violence, maybe they're witnesses even to murder, as lots of kids are in those environments. So then what would be the prospects, so to speak, for those kids over some period of time? And of course, that would also have to do with the quality of the parenting to some extent or other, but it would also have to do with the nature of the social environment. So did they continue to live in those neighborhoods where there was lots of violence? Did they continue to live in dirt poor kind of conditions where they don't even know where the next meal's coming from? So the quality of the social environment, its features really do matter when it comes down to issues of recovery from adversity. Because, of course, living with threat all the time, living in a situation where you feel unsafe, and for very good reason, so that's something that just contributes. So one of the things we know from studies of psychopathology, particularly studies of depression, of major depression and so forth, is that, and by the way, kids who are very young, kids who are in the preschool years, can suffer from or experience very, very severe depression. So, and depression, varies a lot as I'm sure you already know from your own life. I mean, there's minor depression, that's sort of like a common cold or the flu or something. And most of us have that, and probably many, many times in our life. But major depression, of course, is something else entirely. And that's a very, very severe version of depression, right? So, so anyway, the most concerning aspect of studies of long-term prospects of people who have depression is that the first episode of depression, severe depression, makes it more likely to have a second episode. The second episode makes it more likely to have a third episode. So it's sort of the very opposite of the idea that if you go through very negative experiences, whatever it is that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, the actual finding from the science is kind of like the opposite. If you go through something really, really horrible, then you're more vulnerable to that if such things happen again. Whether that would be sexual abuse in childhood or other kinds of trauma or violence or whatever it would be. So again, issues of the social environment. So the idea that in child welfare, for example, that we're only going to focus on psychological issues or on caregiving issues, but somehow the social environment, that's not in our purview. That's not anything we can do anything about much, or so better just to not consider it or something. But it has a very, very large effect, of course, on how kids grow up and the extent to which they can regain normal development. So this issue about resilience, really, from my standpoint, has the issue about particular kids who suffer trauma or various kinds of maltreatment at very young ages, is the extent to which they can recover normal development. And so again, so just to say one thing about kind of the mission of child welfare here, which I've heard now for the last decade, sorry, over and over again, that the mission of child welfare is just to ensure child safety, considered in a very narrow way. I don't really agree with that. I think the mission of child welfare must be to help kids who have been harmed through child maltreatment to recover. It would be very, very weird, for example, to have a version of child welfare in which kids suffer serious physical injury, but somehow the nature of their medical treatment isn't a concern or something to the child welfare system. Well, of course it would be. Well, the same thing goes for mental emotional injury, right? So the idea is that kids who have suffered these kind of grave emotional injuries, which have very real lifelong effects, I'm going to talk about here in just a minute here. Part of the mission of child welfare is to help, should be, in my opinion at least, is to help kids recover from those experiences. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. What would be involved in that kind of recovery, and the extent to which public systems, with the help of private agencies, can actually assist toward that kind of goal here. Okay, so without that as kind of an introductory comment here, I'm just going to stop and see if you have comments or questions. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, as I have in some of these past trainings, we'll talk a little bit about the adverse childhood experiences studies, which I think I'd be very surprised if, any of you haven't heard about these studies, and maybe really a lot about them. And I've talked about these studies before in these trainings, so maybe this will be kind of repetitive, but these studies, of course, were first done in Kaiser Permanente in California and San Diego in the mid-1990s. They involved 15 to 20,000 middle class, upper middle class adults, mostly white. And they had people fill out a kind of a retrospective survey about their childhoods, in which they looked at 7 or 8 factors. And the factors were growing up with substance abuse, growing up with domestic violence, growing up with a chronically mentally ill parent, being physically abused more than one time in a way that caused injury that required medical treatment, being emotionally abused, and being separated from a parent at an early age, right? So the initial list of factors there didn't even include neglect. Now, a lot of the recent adverse childhood experiences surveys, the ones that are more recent, they do include that, but the initial ones didn't, and they also didn't include poverty. So they didn't include some of the obvious kind of adversities there. But, given the fact that that's what they did, people then gave themselves a score, and no one checked on the accuracy of the score or anything. They gave themselves a score, and then they looked at the relationship between that score and the adults, and mostly these were people in their 50s and 60s. What was their history, their health history in their adult years, and issues related to mortality. And so the reason these studies became famous is because they found a dose-related relationship. That is, the higher the score, the worse the health throughout the lifespan. And that included higher rates of early death, early mortality, and particularly in relationship to some conditions, specifically in relationship to obesity, to diabetes, to heart conditions, to some cancers, but not all cancers, to lots of gastrointestinal issues and problems, and to a whole range of mental health issues, including the likelihood of being involved in substance abuse, having sexually transmitted diseases, being extremely depressed, or having a psychiatric condition that needed treatment. So a whole range of health and mental health effects into one's 50s and 60s, and dose related. And so in those particular studies, I think I mentioned before, half of those people who filled out those surveys in San Diego in the 1990s said that they had zero adversities in childhood. I never met anyone like that. I'd never known anyone in my entire life who would make the claim that they didn't suffer any adversities in childhood. But there must be a lot of those people out there. I just don't happen to know them. But it turned out that particularly the difference between having a score of 0 or having a score of 1 in terms of the ACE survey kind of thing, and having a score of 4 or higher, that has turned out to be a major kind of dichotomy. And most of a dichotomy means a big difference. And so for kids in the child welfare system who have suffered sometimes multiple forms of maltreatment, usually physical and abuse and or neglect along with emotional abuse, so at least a score of 2 there, a lot of times a score of 3 or higher, along with substance abuse, mental health conditions, DV, and so forth. Most of those kids have scores of 4 or more. So that means that they are highly liable, not just to a whole bunch of childhood effects, but to effects on their health and on their mental health across the lifespan. So they're a very, very vulnerable group of people. And so this is another reason why the idea that we're going to limit child welfare to the current moment, to kids who are at risk of imminent harm, that's all we're concerned about. But it's fine if they die when they're 20 or 30 or whatever. That would be acceptable, I guess, or something, according to this line of thinking. So the idea then is for those kids who have those histories, those high ACE scores, and what can be done there. So I think I've mentioned before that I've occasionally heard presentations from the developers of these studies, several of these guys become quite famous here. And some of them have been to Washington State on more than one time. And those studies have been done, by the way, on school populations in Washington. And I've heard these guys present. These happen to be men, and I've heard them present. And at the end of the presentation, someone in the audience always asks them, well, what about those of us out here who have high ACE scores, as, for example, I do? But we're still cooking. I mean, we're still functional. I mean, some of us have lived long lives. And what would account for that? So of course they're asking about what protective factors would there be there that would protect those of us with high ACE scores from, early deaths, all kind of horrible illnesses, etc. And of course, those people, those developers, those researchers, of course, they have opinions on those subjects, but they didn't actually use their ACE studies to do research on the subject. And there's no really good reason from my perspective, why they didn't. I mean, they had all the information there. They had a lot of information. They could have done it. It just wasn't of interest to them. I guess it wasn't of enough interest for them to do it right there. And so I've seen a number of, audiences. Sometimes people get mad. I don't get mad. I just get irked. I just thought, well, what an opportunity. You had a great opportunity here to look at protective factors that would inform public policy in all kinds of ways, and you didn't do it? Well, why? But the fact is that they didn't do it. Well, it just turns out, of course, that a lot of other researchers have done it, and not mainly in the context of child welfare, for the most part in other kinds of, sometimes, for example, for kids who are in delinquent populations in the juvenile justice population, or for kids who have childhood illnesses, or, there have been a number of studies of resilience from the many types of perspectives. And so, and while there are some mixed findings there, there are also a consistent group of findings that just are really actionable. And it's sort of like, from my standpoint, the most important, because they are consistent and they're actionable, they're the most important findings. Well, and the best summary I've seen of those findings is in a book about trauma and recovery by Judith Herman, which came out initially in 1992. In my view, still the greatest book in trauma. And so an inspired book. And Herman had done a lot of work with Vietnam veterans who, had been in combat and who had PTSD symptoms. And she discovered in her clinical work kind of the obvious. I mean, some of these guys got over PTSD pretty quickly. And by the way, the really positive message in recent years from the evidence-based world is that there are really a whole range of very good treatments for PTSD that actually are really super effective. I mean, really effective, very, very high effect sizes. And so, but before Herman even knew about any of those studies, she identified from her clinical work what were the main differences between the men who recovered from these traumas that had to do with combat and the men who didn't recover quickly or perhaps at all. And so the main differences, and I think I've mentioned this before, I'm going to go through this again just real quickly, is that the men who recovered first, they could ally with other people under conditions of danger. So I want to say that again, that in combat, they could ally with other people under conditions of danger. So among the resilient group, there were no lone rangers. There were no people who just learned how to be sort of independent, didn't need other people, blah, blah, blah. So this is always one of the fantasies that I think a lot of people have. I definitely had this idea in my early life that somehow I could function without depending on other people in a major league way, and it would be better for a variety of reasons to do that. The studies say exactly the opposite, that there has to be the ability to form these relationships of alliance. And of course, the underlying theme there is that to do that, you have to have the ability to form relationships in the first place, positive relationships. And that generally comes from early childhood. So that's the first of the lesson. The second of the lessons was that these guys were able to emotionally regulate. And I'm going to come back because that's the main effect of early trauma is to interfere with people's capacity to self-regulate their emotions. And that's what happens with kids, but it also happens with adults as well. And so this is why in so many of these trainings, I've come back to this theme, because if people can emotionally self-regulate, they cannot live in this society. They cannot make it through the school system. At some point, they are going to be incarcerated or they are going to be dead. So the ability to self-regulate is just a basic survival function. And of course, so these guys who recovered, now Herman's work didn't say how they got that way. I mean, we're going to come back to this in just a second. She just said they were that way. And thirdly, they had a proactive coping style, so they weren't passive about meeting challenges. They didn't always do the right thing, but they did something. They weren't apathetic. So of course, and then, so those were the three features that she found. And then over the years, in relationship to the child welfare population, I added the factor of having a proactive talent, a pro-social active talent, some ability, capacity that brings positive social recognition to the child, to the teenager, to the young adult, and so forth, right? So those four things in terms of the ability here again to rebound from adversity, those four things. And so before I go any further here, let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions.
Dee, this is Valerie from Stevens County. I just have a question. Do you think 13-year-olds can self-regulate without major help?
Yes. And in fact, I would be and even that would even, by the way, be true of a 3-year-old. A lot of 2- and 3-year-olds can learn to self-regulate to some extent or other. This is part of the function of positive parenting. It really is that initially, the idea is that kids, when they are hungry or tired or whatever, when they're quickly emotionally dysregulated. And of course, we know that's true of very young children. But over the years, when they get positive responses from caregivers in response to their needs, then gradually they get control of, so to speak, the switches of self-regulation. And that is something that begins to happen in early childhood. Definitely, it should have happened by the time kids are in early adolescence. And if it hasn't happened, then kids are going to have a heck of a lot of trouble making it through the school system there, because people are going to get increasingly afraid of them as they get bigger, and particularly if they have the kind of meltdowns that goes with the lack of self-regulation. And so if any of you have ever seen or experienced what it means to have a meltdown, for a child to have a meltdown, and that can be kids of any age, really, from very, very young to on in their very young adulthood. Those are very, very frightening experiences there for everyone involved, including the kid himself or herself. So yeah, by age 13, kids can definitely learn. And then let's just say that they have a inability or a reduced ability to self-regulate. There is still a lot that can be done, much that can be done by skilled people for children in that age range. And so there's a very outstanding book called Trauma Treatment for Adolescents, for Traumatized Children and Adolescents. And so one of the authors is Sachs, but I'll send Ryan a list of these resources and so forth. But the reason that this book is really good is because it has concrete ideas for how you help kids to learn to emotionally self-regulate. And kids of all ages. And I've mentioned in other trainings that I've done is that the Deborah Dayro books, particularly the Nurturing Adoptions book, that is so good because it's so practical. It has such concrete ideas for how you help kids at all developmental stages, all ages, all developmental stages, to be able to gradually self-soothe, to be less stress reactive, and be able to calm down to some extent or other. And that is something that, of course, that's part of to say this again, that's part of the function of parents. It's parents' role to help kids do that through very, many, many, many experiences on a daily basis of kids becoming, quote, dysregulated for various reasons, and then gradually coming into regulation with the help of the parent. And so the problem, of course, for most maltreated kids, or many maltreated kids, particularly the ones who are severely maltreated in early childhood, is that they don't trust a caregiver enough to use a caregiver to help them to calm down. So that is what it takes to get kids back on developmental course here, to learn to self-regulate. So this is sort of one of the basic lessons from the literature on trauma and resilience on self-regulation, is that kids who are very distrustful because of their early experiences in life need to develop to the point where they can use adults to calm down. And that's how we know we're making progress with those kids. And so let me just briefly explain what happens to kids who don't have that capacity. So you might have a young child who is in the toddler age, and maybe they're 14 months old or a little bit older, and they toddle around, they fall, they get owies, they get knots on their head, they cry, and you expect kids who, for that happen, they're gonna go to a caregiver for reassurance. That's a sign of a secure attachment. That is, when I'm in need, when I'm hurting, someone is going to care enough about me. I can go to them and they will reassure me. They will comfort me. They will do something for me. But you can have kids who have early experiences with maltreatment where they don't go to a caregiver to calm down. They go to their bed, they lay down, they put their thumbs in their mouth, they may not cry at all. And so sometimes foster parents will respond to that kind of thing by, almost admiring this little kind of a stoic little 18-month-old child, doesn't even cry, doesn't even show a reaction to pain. They view that as some kind of exceptional, admirable development, when it's actually, of course, quite the opposite. It's abnormal development that puts kids on a very bad developmental trajectory. So initially, early in life, if you talk about what we want to help kids to do, is we want to help the kids to use adults to calm down. Concretely, that's what we want to be able to do. And there is now the difference in child welfare now than when I worked in child welfare, 20 years ago or something, is that there's a huge amount of information about how to do that. I mean, we have tons of knowledge here, which wasn't true when I worked for child welfare systems in this state in the early 2000s. We didn't have tons of information. So part of that, I've mentioned the Deborah Gray book, which is good. I've mentioned the Sachs book, and I'm going to send you a list of these resources. And there also is a very good program called Developmental Repair, developed in Minnesota, which is a day treatment program that has really good concrete ideas for how you do that, right? So again, okay. So what's the underlying idea here that I'm trying to get across here? First, resilience is kind of more, I'm not thinking of child welfare here, but thinking of kids in general. It's more the norm than it is the exception. I want to say that again. So rebounding from adversity is more the norm in human life for all ages and all groups than it is the exception. So we're not talking about some exceptional group of people who have some sort of extraordinary genetics and who can just somehow rebound from adversity, but most people can't. No, it's the other way around. Most people rebound from adversity because we're set up like that. We're set up like that to be able to get over things, not just physically. We heal, our bodies heal for the most part. And that's also true in a mental, kind of emotional way. And so what we want to do in child welfare then is we want to help those normal recovery processes, which are already there. They're already there, right? So we just got to kind of help them. So we need to know kind of initially the main developmental asset. So this is a function of developmental assets. So I guess this is the main idea I want to get across here. Kids recover from adversity, and here I mean including all kinds of child maltreatment experiences, based on the extent to which they have developmental assets. And if the more developmental assets they have, the quicker on average they recover, the more full the recovery is. The less developmental assets they have, the harder the recovery is and the longer it kind of takes there. So the main developmental asset in early childhood is it's an attached relationship with a caregiver. So that's the most important developmental asset in the first year of life, apart from good health. And by the way, a lot of developmental assets are things we just take for granted. So we take them for granted until we don't have them. So at all ages, the main developmental asset that most of us have is, if we're in good health, that's a tremendous advantage in every respect. I mean, being able to function in life, but also being able to rebound from various adversities, right? And so it becomes much harder when we have chronic illnesses, when we have chronic mental health conditions of various sorts, when people are using drugs and alcohol to cope, when, all kind of bad things happen in life there that interfere with those developmental kind of assets there. So one more idea for one more example to get this idea across real quick. And I apologize if this is redundant for you, but because there's a point to telling this story, I'm going to tell it again here. So the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, came out in 2006 or 7. Bruce Perry was the main author, along with Maya Salovitz, who, by the way, I think lived in Seattle at the time, a journalist. And so Perry's a trauma expert, runs a trauma center in Texas. So this is a story about his life, and he's kind of the hero of these stories, and he's got a big ego, but at the same time, he knows a heck of a lot of stuff. And so he tells his story, the story that forms the name of the book, The Boy Who Raised as a Dog, about when he was an intern, pretty young, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, at a hospital emergency room in the Bay Area. And he was called in to do a consult on this little boy, 6 years old, who was in the middle of the emergency room, and he was being kept in a cage, a locked cage. And the boy was down on his hands and knees, and he was covered in food and feces, and he's uttering guttural sounds, and he's throwing food and feces at the docs and the nurses, and the docs and the nurses are very upset with him, and they call Perry in, and it seems like they want Perry to say that the kid has genetic brain damage and probably needs to be in an institution or something. But but Perry does something that none of the other experts in that emergency room had done. And I've asked this question over the years to caseworkers. I've done this, I've told this scenario in training a lot. And I'll bet I've asked 50 groups of people. It might even be more. What was the one thing the docs did in that emergency room that no other doc had done? What did Perry do that no other medical expert in that setting had done? I have never, not one person has ever told me the right answer. So what some people say is, well, he got down on his hands and knees, which of course he eventually does. That he tried to form a connection with the kid, which he eventually does. But that's not what he did first. What he did first was he took a careful early history. And what he found out, he took a careful early history. So here's a lesson here. If you want to understand bizarre behavior of any type by a person of any age, you start off by taking a history, and hopefully an accurate history. So he found out that this little boy had been born to a drug addict mother who had abandoned him when he was about a month old. He lived with a nurturing grandmother for the next 11 months, and grandmother died when he's about a year old. And then he goes to live with a friend of the grandmother's who's a dog kennel operator. He spends the next 5 years mostly in a dog cage, in this kennel kind of place. And then he's brought in to the hospital at age 6 because he has pneumonia. The hospital experts find out, the medical experts find out, well, this is like a feral little animal or something. This little boy can't walk. This little boy can't talk. He's uttering guttural sounds and so forth. And so as soon as Perry hears his history, he knows the kid probably isn't genetically brain damaged. I mean, he might be, but his best guess, no, he's a severely neglected kid. And so at that point, Perry then, understanding this, he gets down on his hands and knees and he gets away from the cage and he throws a bit of a muffin into the cage. And why does he do that? Because he understands the little boy is starving, because he's throwing food and feces at the docs and nurses. So the little boy eats a little bit of the muffin and likes it. Of course, he's starving. And then Perry gives him some more of the muffin and so forth. And then once he starts to associate Perry with the muffin, with food, he moves closer to the cage. Again, he's down on his hands and knees at eye level. And as soon as he sees that this kid is somewhat accepting of him, then he opens the cage. Then he takes the kid out of the cage into another room in the hospital, less foot traffic, less interaction, less people around. And so, of course, part of the lesson here is that the way you engage people, the way you join with people, this is one of the reasons I use this in training with caseworkers. The way you engage people at any age, you join to need. All IQs, all past experiences. You join to need. This kid is starving to death. Gets the kid in the other room. So what's the point there? He has to help the kid to feel safe. So this is sort of the lesson about how you help kids who have histories of trauma. It's how you help adults who have histories, or teenagers who have histories of trauma. Before you can help them, they have to feel safe. So he brings the child into this quieter kind of area, and within the next day or two, they can get him out of the cage. They can bathe him. Less stimulation. Perry calls that pattern repetition. I just call it structure. Within a couple of days, he starts to utter something that sounds like words. He starts to stand up. So Perry describes a process where in the next 4 to 6 weeks, this kid starts to look like a little boy. He actually can stand up. He can walk. He can start to say sounds that are kind of like words. Then he can put words into sentences. So within 3 to 4 months, then this kid is able to go into foster care. Within 3 to 4 months. And then Perry says he had never seen a child who was that, feral, almost really at presentation, recover as quickly. And so then the question was, well, of course, why was that little boy able to do that? Why was this little boy almost completely feral, didn't have language, couldn't even stand up? Why was he able to make this very, very quick recovery and start to look like a little 6-year-old boy? So I've already told you the answer. What's the answer? He had a nurturing relationship with his grandmother for 11 months. He had the best developmental asset there is for a little kid, apart from health. So he had the capacity to form close, intimate relationships with caregivers, and that allowed him to do all kinds of other things. So ultimately, this little kid was able to be helped by services that were already in the hospital setting. He just had to feel safe enough to be able to receive those services. So that's the meaning of developmental assets. Once you have a developmental asset, then helpers can build on that asset. If a kid doesn't have, so people, caseworkers have occasionally asked me the question, well, what if he didn't have that asset? What if he hadn't had a nurturing grandmother? What if he had been maltreated from day one in his life? Or what if he grew up in a Romanian orphanage or something like that? The question is, the answer is he would be much, much harder to help, but you could still do it. It's not like that there's ever a time when a kid cannot be helped, but it's just going to be a lot harder to do it because they don't have the requisite developmental asset there, right? That has to be created then when it's lacking. And so for a lot of the little kids in child welfare, that's the first thing. Of course, we're going to be very interested in the quality of those caregiving relationships, not just in their personal safety, as important as that is, also in the quality of those caregiving relationships, right? And so we want parents to be able to have emotionally responsive, nurturing, affectionate relationships with their children. That's important, apart from this just being physically safe and alive. And so there are lots of programs out there now that help parents to do that. So this isn't like someone has to make it up. Some of those programs were actually invented in this state. I mean, promoting first relationships and some of those evidence-based programs developed at the UW School of Nursing, they're developed in Washington. So yeah, we have to help parents to be able to do that because we want kids to not just survive in life, but we want them to get back on a normal developmental trajectory. To do that, of course, then they have to be able to use a parent to calm down. They have to be able to learn to emotionally self-regulate. And so I recommend this book. It's written for lay people. It's not written for experts. It contains maybe 8, 9, 10 chapters about Perry's experiences. Most of them have to do with neglected kids, but there's also some physically abused kids. There's a chapter about a little, very young child in there who witnessed her mother being murdered, and who the murderer tried to kill her, tried to cut her throat, and the murderer says at the time, it's for your best interest, dude. This is the words the murderer says to the little girl as he cuts her throat. And then she survives. And so anyway, so there's a range of different experiences that are described there. So let me see. Someone maybe had a question or a comment here. Yes, I'm going to send this to Ryan. Yes. Can I restate the 4 things? Yes, the 4 things are the ability to join resiliency factors, the ability to join with others under conditions of danger. That's the first thing. So here we're talking about, of course, Herman's talking about in relationship to combat, but it would be in relationship to any challenging situation. And so I've tried to tell caseworkers over and over again, if you work in child welfare, to survive in those situations, those are such hard jobs. You have to be part of a cohesive unit. And how do I know this? Because for the first several years I worked in child welfare, I worked in another state. And I wasn't a guy who, had good social skills and found it easy to interrelate with groups or everything. I tried to do stuff on my own and I found it didn't work. So if I was going to survive in child welfare, I was a slow learner, took me a while. I finally learned that I had to be part of a cohesive unit. So that's the first most important survival lesson in child welfare right there. You got to be part. If you're doing something hard in life, for example, why are police officers the way they are? Their lives are in danger. Why are they like that in terms of joining together and defending one another through thick and thin, even when they've done evil, bad things, right? Because, of course, that's a condition of thriving and surviving in those situations, right? So that's the first one. The second one is being able to emotionally self-regulate. And this is a problem. This isn't a challenge, not a problem. It's an issue for all of us in life, not just for maltreated kids. It's for everyone. So all of you have some, even though you might not be able to articulate it, perhaps you can. Everyone has found, if you've lived to be 25 years old, you found something that works for you. Now, for some of those people, it might be something like smoking. So, for example, the people who did these adverse childhood experiences studies, one of the things they found is that one of the coping mechanisms for people who had high ACE scores was that they had very high rates of smoking. Why did they have bad health into their 50s and 60s? Because they were self-regulating through tobacco. They were doing something to self-regulate that injured their health, right? So, but there are all kind of other ways. Some people meditate. Some people, they listen to music. Some people, for some people, it's going out with friends and just enjoying themselves. We, depending on who we are, we use all kind of ways of self-regulating, of calming down. And that is one, and if we don't have something like that, then we're probably going to end up doing something that's very, very bad. For example, by drinking ourselves into a stupor or using drugs that numb pain or something like that in the absence of better ideas there. And then, of course, being proactive. So one of the main, most distressing findings from the research about neglected kids, and this is from a longitudinal study that's 30 or 40 years old now, was that the neglected kids in the population there, they had the poorest problem-solving skills because they gave up very, very quickly. So the thing about, so in other words, they weren't persistent when they were presented with real problems, with things they didn't understand that they had to learn. They just tended to give up before other kids did. And that's what it meant to say they didn't have persistence and problem solving. So experiences of child maltreatment, here's the really, take home message here from all this. It undermines all those developmental assets that help us to cope in life. It undermines personal relationships in early childhood. It undermines the ability to self-regulate. It undermines the ability to have proactive coping skills, and it underlines the ability to develop talents. And that's the fourth one, the ability to develop, having some kind of pro-social talent. Because a lot of maltreated kids, they're not going to do well in school. They're going to have trouble even being able to graduate from high school. So a lot of them are not going to do well academically. So a few are, and that's great when they are, but a lot of them aren't. And so they need something else, whether that's athletic talent or whether it's musical talent or being able to work with animals and with horses, or being able to do cooking well or agriculture or computer games or something like that. One of the major findings, for example, in recent years from the studies of kids and the extent to which they spend hours a day on screens, that is on their phones and other kind of screens, is that that's a very negative thing for social development. But there's one exception to that. The kids who are really good at computer games, they don't seem to suffer much negative effects at all. Why not? They're good at it. They're proactive. They're doing something they're good at that brings them social recognition. So that is, for them, that is a resiliency factor. So, and so kids in foster care particularly, we're going to help them in life here. One of the things we need to do is help them develop talents. So an idea that I have tried to sell child welfare agencies on, and I've never found a single agency that has the slightest interest in this. But if we were actually, in my view, enlightened kind of agencies, which we're not on the whole, but if we are, we would be doing things like having talent searches. We would put $100,000 a year or more into a talent search for kids who are anywhere from 6 to 17, and hand out grants of $5,000 to $10,000 a year to those kids to develop talents. They've already shown a spark, an interest in something, whether that be music or whether it be, I live over by the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. I go over there every summer. There are middle-class kids over there in math camps. There are kids over there in cheerleading camps, in football camps, because their parents are investing in them. And that's what we need to be doing with foster kids too. We want them to give a leg up in life. They need to be able to do something well, something pro-social well, that brings them recognition. And in the absence of that, many of those kids are going to develop skills that are in the negative, anti-social aspect, particularly the skill of being very good at violence. Being very good at violence and not other things, that's a formula for disaster. That person is going to prison or he's going to be killed. Or in a rare instance, is going to be mentally ill and be on a psychiatric. So, you want people to develop pro-social kind of skills there. Everyone who works with kids in child welfare can do that. Everyone can. You know, we don't even have to put special money up, even though it would be enlightened to do that. That's what we ought to be actually doing here. We can also help families, for example, the idea of, you know, it's easy to sell the idea that we're going to help families with food and clothing and shelter, all these basic things. But what about recreation? What about things that most of us just take for granted here? What about a night out bowling? Or what about going to a park or something like, you know, what about doing things that make life enjoyable? Those are things that would be very, very helpful to families and to kids there, because kids are going to discover interest. And when they discover interest, we can help them with that in the way that we help our kids and grandkids, right? So those are the four kind of things there, right? Now, I've already mentioned school. And for many of these kids, school in our society is just so incredibly important. And so for the maltreated group of kids to have low rates of high school graduation, you know, that just sets those kids up for homelessness, for unemployment, for petty theft, for all kind of really bad things. So one of the things we should be doing, at least in my opinion, we should be helping those kids who are struggling in school with various kinds of mentoring and coaching, and to help them just, you know, so getting that high school degree at a bare minimum, that's a really super, super important thing. So we want to help kids to be able to cope with school. And I've already mentioned the issue around their supports, around extended family members. So sometimes one of the things that foster care does really, really poorly is maintain all those social relationships that are in extended families, right? And so, you know, a kid that goes in foster care and maybe stays a year or two, and somehow, or maybe stays longer, and they lose not just their parents, they lose their whole extended family. That's not how to help people cope in life. You do it the other way around. So kids who are, for example, who are aging out of foster care at age 17 or 18, they of course they need money. Of course they need the opportunity to go to community college. They need housing. They need all that stuff. They also need a support system, just like our kids do. And that's what we need to do to help kids to, so to speak, rebound from adversity here. Um, so it just isn't I guess the idea I'm trying to get across, it isn't just the idea of providing kids who've had these maltreatment histories with some good mental health treatment. As important as that is, I'm not saying it's not important, it is. But for kids to rebound from adversity, they need these other things as well. They need social support. They need talents. They need a special focus on the ability to emotionally self-regulate, and they need experiences of joining with others. And you know where that comes in American society? You know, I've tried to understand, you know, we're in the middle now of March Madness here. You know, everyone who's a basketball fan could spend, I guess, all day, every day for the next couple of weeks watching these games, right? You know why sports are so incredibly important in American life? Because it's one of the few experiences a lot of Americans have with actually being a part of a team that they totally buy into. You know, of thinking something beyond themselves, being actually team spirit. That is phenomenally important experience in life. And so a lot of people's, their most vivid memories of young adulthood or being a teenager or something is being on these sports teams. And so, yeah, so having kids have that kind of experience of being a part of a group that's doing something important that they're passionate about. And so they're great. I guess the last thing I want to do is just recommend a couple of resources here, which I think have more to say on this subject than, you know, the books I've recommended are good, but just in terms of accessibility, I want to recommend a couple of other things here. So there's a French movie from about 10, 12 years ago called The Chorus. And you can, I mean, it wasn't a famous movie. It's good, but it's about some kids mostly from pretty well-off families who were, you know, doing pretty poorly in their schools, and they're badass kids and everything. So their parents send them to this school, and there's a guy who comes in there who doesn't know anything about kids, but he loves music. And so he joins all these oppositional kids into a choir. And the kids have the experience of actually becoming a really, really good choir. And that experience changes their life. There's a documentary. This isn't a real that came out about 10, 12 years ago about a ballroom dancing contest in New York City for kids in the middle school grades from these low-income neighborhoods. And it shows these kids develop into these teams, so these ballroom dancing teams, and they compete against other schools. And their teachers and principals, they're so into it. I mean, they're so incredibly enthused about what these kids are doing. And it shows how these kids just flower. And they don't come into that with any skills for the most part in ballroom dancing, like none. And over a period of months, they become pretty good at it, pretty skilled at it. They go into competition. Some do very well, some don't. But the whole experience of being a part of a group like that's working into a common goal, that's a tremendously important experience in life for young people to have. And a lot of the kids who have really bad outcomes in life, they never have an experience like that. We can make it more likely for that to occur to them. We can't ensure that it's going to happen, but we can make it more likely to happen. So anyway, those are kind of the ideas here. And so it's let me stop one last time and give you a chance for a comment or questions here.
In terms of the structure of like, one of the big things that we, or at least when I'm training new volunteers, is to think about Maslow's hierarchy in terms of building up like essentially like a case plan, or what their interaction with the child. And so it seems really, so I tell folks, it seems really silly. They meet it their immediate, when the kid placed into foster care within the first week or two, to go out and try to get them violin lessons. Like,
Well,
that's not,
course.
yeah. But where does that fit within that kind of, they're already experiencing trauma? Where should we be looking at, or where should we be thinking about, like, in terms of time frame resiliency?
Well, of course, I mean, I think the Maslow stuff, I think it's useful there. I think you start off in thinking of basic needs kind of thing there. And of course, we want kids to be safe. We want them to have nurturing caregivers. We want them to be able to maintain connections with their parents and extended family members and siblings to the extent that we can. So, so initially, that of course is going to be the focus there. Now, maybe the one exception I would say for the school-age kids, the kids who are already in school, you would hope that the people in their life would do whatever they could to maintain kids in those schools that they've been in. That's not always possible, but times it is. So that would be important. It's very important then, once you get past those basic physical needs, to think about kids' social relationships. So think about how sad it is in life for kids not to be able to have friends. I mean, think about how important friendships are in life. Some kids, that just comes natural to, but a lot of kids who have had very hard early lives, that isn't something that comes easy to them. And so thinking about evidence-based programs that focus on social skills. And of course, if kids have emotional problems, we want those to be, identified early in life and dealt with in some kind of way. Of course, that would be important to them, right? Now, the longer that kids are in care, I think the general rule would be, once kids have been in care about 3 to 6 months, and it looks like they're going to be in care longer than that, then you start to expand your focus somewhat, right? Start to look a little bit beyond that and think about, and of course, thinking about how are we maintaining those family ties, and not just in terms of the parents, but also, of course, obviously the siblings, but also extended family members there. What can be done there? And usually the truth is a lot can be done. The one other thing I do want to say on this subject, just one other thing real briefly, because particularly around the young kids who go into care, and some of them have very positive experiences. Other ones, of course, are moved around in care from time to time. A lot of times those kids who went into foster care before they were 6 years old or something like that, once they get into their early to middle teens, they may not have any record of their early experiences in life at all. If those kids have been adopted, then maybe someone hopefully has gone to the trouble of doing some kind of adoption book about their early experiences. But what about the kids in foster care? What about just doing something that's just so common sense and so easy with the technology we have now of providing a record of those kids when they were 2 and 3 years old. We actually have pictures to give kids. We have the names of foster parents. We show some respect for people's kids' ability to kind of understand their early experiences and so forth. So, some of the things that, that go on in foster care, kind of understandable things, but other things, truthfully, just, I don't know what to say here without, maybe saying something I shouldn't say here, but sometimes it's just not thinking through the thing about, what would we want to happen if it were our kids? What would we want to happen if it were our nephews or nieces or grandkids or something like that? What kind of experience would we want them to have? And starting off with that kind of golden rule kind of idea there, and then trying to make it happen to the extent that we can there. So some foster parents understand this intuitively and are just great. Other ones don't. There are a lot of foster parents who simply don't understand the rudiments of normal social development. And so, for example, if you want foster parents to understand that if a kid gets hurt and they're not coming to the foster parent for help, something's wrong. You want foster parents to approach that child and to give nurture and to give help. So these books that I mentioned that I'm going to send you the names of, these are books that can be given to foster parents and ought to be given to foster parents in every instance. They cost less than $20 in paperback, for Christ's sakes. So we can learn how to do, so foster parents need to, identify when kids are developing in an abnormal way that's bad. The other kind of thing that happens a lot of times is you might have kids in foster care who are sort of so anxious about the attachment they have. They're following a foster parent around on their heels at all times. And at some point, so that's called anxious attachment. At some point, a foster parent gets upset with that behavior, as all of us would. And maybe they yell at the kid, or maybe they even push the kid or slap the kid or something like that. They just make it all worse, right? So you want foster parents to understand something about attachment styles, some basic information about attachment styles. What does it mean for a 12-month-old child to have an attachment style? What's the difference between secure attachment, between disorganized attachment, the most extreme version of this, between anxious attachment, between ambivalent attachment? Those aren't hard concepts. The Deborah Gray book have a brief, concise explanations of all those concepts. And so everyone who comes into contact with kids, and particularly the caregivers, and this includes parents as well, you want them to have an understanding of those concepts and to understand to do some of the rudimentary kind of things. We need to be able to help kids to calm down. Those are really basic skills. Those aren't skills that you have to go to a therapist to learn. For the most part, we can learn those things. And a lot of times we know them from our own kids, right? We don't have to even read a book. So anyway, just ideas there.
I have one question.
Mhm.
Regarding the you talked about a book, an album, like where the foster parents like keep pictures, and I've done that with a foster family where they were going to a new foster family. But do you recommend them starting it as soon as they go into foster care?
Yeah, unless you think that this child is going to leave there within a few days. I mean, there are some kids who go into foster care. In fact, a surprising number that go home within a week or something. But, putting those kids aside for a second, I think that foster parents should be trained that this is just one of the things you do for kids.
Okay. And is there, because I know the other foster mom I have, she's very willing to do it. I just know she's super busy. So if there's like something that you recommend that would make it, really, I'm sure there's programs out there that she can maybe.
Well, the people to ask about doing it are the people who work in adoptions, because they do it all the time.
Okay.
So they've got formats and everything, right? But to start off with, the thing that would be great is just take some pictures. How about that? If you've got a phone, you take some pictures, and then every once in a while you make a note about the child. Not a long note. You just write a sentence or two about something that the child did that was charming or affectionate, or something that might even have been a distressing something or something. You just make a note, and then you got a list of these notes there at some point in time. So anyway, just as an idea there. And I just don't think that kind of stuff takes a lot of money. It just takes time and consideration, really. So, And the fact that we haven't done it for foster kids as a routine kind of thing in this country, there's something about that that's shocking. You know, I'm thinking about that when I was a regional administrator a long, long time ago. I had to stop people from moving kids around with garbage bags. That had been going on for years and years. It took an actual directive from me to stop people from moving kids with garbage bags. And for all I know, it's going on today. I don't know that it is or isn't. But how could that even be? How could it even be that we put kids out on a porch with a garbage bag with their stuff in it? You know, that says more than anyone can ever say about the regard for foster kids right there. So that's something that I mean, you don't need child welfare reform stuff to stop that kind of stuff, or to start doing stuff that just shows basic decency and consideration and regard. This kid is going to grow up. They're going to wonder about themselves, where they came from and so forth, right? And so, yeah, anyway. I think I'll stop there. And Ryan, I will, if it's not later today, it will be on Monday. I will send you a list of these resources and so forth, right? And again, I think the resources have these movies that I mentioned, but to say that again, the movies are Mad Hot Ballroom and The Chorus, in case you want to find them, and they're probably available online.
And Dee, while you were talking about life books and things like that, there's an amazing number on Etsy that you guys should check out. People that have built these copies of books that you can fill out yourself, or, you know, help fill out with the kids too, especially in your role as an advocate. So you might be the only one that has that history from foster parent. So not a bad idea to keep a journal like that. So
Great. Thanks. Yeah. Good luck, guys.
thanks, Dee.
Bye-bye.
Oh, have a great weekend, everyone. See you next month.